Welcome, Atonement. Anyone watching, good to have you join us. You hopefully will see the words on the screen so that you can sing along with us as we worship together with Holden Evening Worship. We begin together.
Jesus Christ, you are the light of the world.
The light no darkness can overcome.
Stay with me now, for it is evening, and the day is almost over. Let your light scatter the darkness and shine within your people here. Joyous light of heavenly glory, loving glow of God's own face, you who sing creation's story, shine on every land and race. Now as evening falls around us, we shall raise our songs to you, God of daybreak, God of shadows, come and light our hearts anew. In the stars that grace the darkness, in the blazing sun of dawn, in the light of peace and wisdom, we can hear your quiet song. Love that fills the night with wonder, love that warms the weary soul, love that burns all chains asunder, set us free and make us whole. You who made the heavens splendor, every dancing star of night, make us shine with gentle justice. Let us each reflect your light. Mighty God of all creation, gentle Christ who lights our way, loving Spirit of salvation, lead us on to endless day.
May God be with you all.
And also with you.
Let us sing our thanks to God.
It is right to give God thanks and praise.
Blessed are you, Creator of the universe. From old you have led your people by night and day. May the light of your Christ make our darkness bright. For your word and your presence are the light of our pathways, and you are the light and life of all creation.
Let my prayer rise up like incense before you, the lifting up of my hands as an offering to you. Oh God, I call to you.
Oh God,
Come to me now. Oh, come to my voice when I pray. come before you, O God, as incense, and may your presence surround and fill us, so that in union with all creation, we might sing your praise and your love in our lives. Amen.
Amen. All right. So, welcome here, everybody who's watching for another one of our Holden Evening Honest Stories. And welcome to Nat. Now, I'm thinking Nat
Anderson-Lippert.
Anderson-Lippert.
It was Lippert.
Lippert. Okay. Yes. All right. And the reason that I know Nat is because his wife, Maria, is one of the pastors at Christ the King. And so that's kind of, and then I met you, I think, last summer when you came for one of our campfire worship deals. Mm-hmm. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for being here. And you did not grow up in Minnesota.
No, very much not.
No, so your story begins in Maine, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell us a little bit about your growing up?
Sure. Well, and I should say, it's a funny thing. You know, my wife Maria said, you know, Pastor Siri was asking about you and your story, and she was particularly talking about people who are not religious.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I am a pastor's spouse.
Right.
I don't know quite if I qualify, but I'm happy to talk to Pastor Siri anytime and your congregation. So thank you.
And just, you know, I think just to start off, you would think that someone who'd marry a pastor, that's a whole nother story of my personal story, but someone that marry a pastor would be like, you know, love the churchy stuff and everything. But that's not the case. We have a couple cases where that's not so. And so, you know, we talked, and I got to hear much more about your story. And so, yeah, tell us about your growing up.
Well, and I say that because, and actually through Maria, I came to appreciate this more, is that, so I grew up in Maine, on the East Coast, and Maine, I learned, this may not have always been true, but at least now is, by some measures, the most secular state in the country. Okay. Or I think people say it's the least churched by regular worship attendance. And so for me, it was just a very different context. And that's been striking to me. So we met in Maine, had both moved back to Maine, or I'd moved back to Maine from the Bay Area, where Maria actually did seminary. And she was serving a congregation out there. And so she has that context. That's kind of a shared context for us. But growing up, part of the reason it was a funny question for me about kind of religious identity is my dad is a preacher's kid also.
Sure.
Through the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which later I think is where the United Methodist came from.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And so I grew up thinking of our family as a relatively religious family in that context. Even where we didn't go to church at all.
You didn't go to church.
Right, exactly. But culturally, you know, we had that history of my parents very much grew up in church, and I think, and we were talking about this on the phone, that I've speculated that maybe they were part of a generation that grew up probably youngish in the 50s, very much going to church, and then came of age and were like, this is not for me, and I don't necessarily agree with all the values that I grew up with, and didn't raise their kids going to church. Yeah. And so I think we were kind of that generation. And growing up in Maine, it wasn't the dominant culture, I would say.
Right. And so if you're in a culture where no one really knows anything about church so much or doesn't care and doesn't go, but you're like a pastor's grandkid.
Right.
So that feels like
there's some connection.
There's some kind of connection there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was interesting, and then, you know, I was saying earlier, is kind of like I think a second phase of that was going off to college. Outside of Philadelphia, I went to a small Quaker college because my dad had gone to a Quaker college, and what I encountered there, and maybe this is like a bigger phenomenon, I think people thought of people who went to church as kind of naive, or, you know, like there was kind of almost a judgment of churchgoers.
Sure.
And so I found that also in that circle, in this small like liberal arts college, going to church was also very much not part of the dominant culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So your whole kind of first part of life really that not going to church was just sort of the norm.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you did come into contact with, I think you might call it spirituality, right? So sometimes people differentiate religion from spirituality. And what I've always talked about is religion is sort of the institution. It's the church building, and it's the denominations, and it's the bishops and the pastors and the liturgy or whatever. And spirituality, which can belong in that, in some ways is more individual. It's your personal connection with God or with the universe, or however you define it, and it's your own practice. And so people could say that they're religious but not spiritual. People could say they're religious and spiritual, and people could say they're spiritual but not religious, or something like that. But not necessarily throwing any labels on you,
Right.
but you did sort of have some experiences where you came up with your own sense of belief.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I think that there, I mean, I haven't thought about this much, but I think that I think there is a way where if we had gone to church growing up, probably that deep part of myself that was spiritually curious and kind of seeking, I think would easily have been engaged.
Okay.
But it wasn't at all part of my context.
Sure.
And so I think that's true, that I would say the religion that I did encounter maybe informed this through Quakerism and kind of the practice of sitting in silence and having that be part of worship and the majority of worship. But I think that's what I found more than anything, is that particularly in the last 5 or so years, that how would I say that? Meditation and having practices of silence have been very important to me spiritually,
Yeah.
including with other people, meditating together.
Mm-hmm.
And I've maybe being married to a pastor, I've grown accustomed to like spiritual but not religious is often like a
Yeah.
quip of
Yeah.
pastors of annoyance or something. But
Yeah.
but I think that's true, and I think that Maria's often joked about what you said, the dominant
Yep.
culture here, and in many places cannot be the reverse of being like religious but not spiritual.
Yeah, sometimes it can be uncomfortable. I realize when you sit in silence in church, or we try breathing or something contemplative, that's not necessarily comfortable for everybody. But that's a contemplative practice. And I think I don't know if you named that word, but contemplative practices are a deep part of every faith, but definitely Christianity. Just not always been emphasized a lot. And it's certainly not been emphasized tons in the Lutheran tradition, but it's there. So sitting in silence, or like quietly singing the same thing, and sort of getting just processing and just focusing on something is definitely, it's there, but not always what's emphasized in mainstream religion.
Well, no, I think for me, one question that I had, early on, my parents have since, and maybe this is also a trend within that generation, but have since joined the Unitarian Universalist Church.
Oh, sure.
Which I think does capture a lot of people who were like, felt comfortable in the space of church, but were looking for, a way to live out their values differently, or
Really
something.
broad.
Yeah, very
Yes,
broad.
yes.
Right. And even there, when I moved back to Maine in 2013, even there I would enter that space, and I found that kind of like the deepest parts of me that were spiritually engaged and seeking were not necessarily engaged in that space. And I think, and you asked me the other day, like, are there church spaces, or are there worship services that do speak to you? And the one that did come to mind was actually a more contemplative service, I think as part of an Advent series.
Yeah.
And it was more of like a Taizé service of, repetition and music and space for reflection.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I found that to be very inviting to me.
Yeah, that's neat.
Yeah.
And we actually didn't talk very much about, you meeting Maria, and at that point she was already probably in her first call when you met her, and
In
so
Maine, yeah.
how did
She's gonna laugh because I'm happy to talk at length about her and our relationship and tell your entire congregation about her.
I won't pry too much,
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, was that an interesting moment when you said, "What do you do for a living?" And she's like, "Well, you see."
It's funny that I'll say one thing that she'll allow me to say, that she was nervous about that, about what it means to be a young female pastor in this world, and we met and kind of came together through worker justice organizing at a worker center in Maine,
okay.
and I think that
Yeah.
was quickly like the common values,
Yeah.
and probably that do speak to like the more of the values that I was raised with through, probably influenced by both my parents growing up in church. But I think we did land on those common values.
Because you're both really big into justice issues and equality. And just in case people don't know, what is your job?
I'm a union organizer with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. So we're, there's a lot of things going on right now with schools being shut down and distance learning getting set up, and making sure that everyone gets paid for the duration of the shutdown, particularly hourly workers in Minnesota. But,
yeah, big concerns about that. But I just think it was interesting that when I called to set up a time where we could talk this over, you're like, well, I can't be on this day because of the teacher strike. So,
Right.
that's part of your work. And I know that that's one of the things that brought you and your wife together was, and she's if you know her at all, you can tell she has a huge heart for equality and justice and compassion and all of that stuff. And so those are huge values you both share.
Yeah, well, and I think we've had some good conversations during this time of like, what is the role of the church right now during COVID-19? During lots of need in the world, certainly that's objective material need, but then I do think it's a time when a lot of people are asking big questions and looking for some sort of grounding.
Yeah. And it may be, and we kind of talked about this, that as we're seeing both on the national scene in terms of economy and government and politics, but then maybe even on the religious spiritual world, is that when things get shaken up like a dice, it's an opportunity to say what actually really matters, what's really important at the end of the day, and what isn't, and that conversation that we can have about all of those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is circulating most kind of in my world is that many of the workers that yesterday, whose jobs yesterday would have been called, service workers or people who are kind of unnecessary, are now like on the front lines and getting paid hazard pay because they're so necessary to everything surviving. So I do think it's true that this is a moment when people are reconsidering kind of who's valuable, which speaks to, I think, many of the values of the church.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Very much for being here. And I think it's really helpful for us to sit down and hear people's stories and how people can have such really neat values and perspectives and trajectories of how they landed where they are. And it's nice for us to just sometimes sit and listen to where people are. And
I think it's great. I think it's great that so many people in so many churches are doing this right now and getting to experience their own church and kind of how to be together in this moment, but then also get to, maybe have dinner. I know this is going to be a Wednesday service, but, talk about it and experience it in a different way. So thank you for inviting me to come.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We'll return back to our Holden evening service. Once again, please sing along with the words that are on the side of the screen. his name shall be Jesus, the chosen one of God Most High. And Mary said, I am the servant of my God. I live to do your will. My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you. You have looked with love on your servant here, and blessed me all my life through. Great and mighty are you, O Holy One. Strong is your kindness evermore. How you favor the weak and lowly one, humbling the proud of heart. You have cast the mighty down from their thrones, and uplifted the humble of heart. You have filled the hungry with wondrous things, and left the wealthy no part. Great and mighty are you, O faithful one. Strong is your justice, strong your love. As you promised to Sarah and Abraham, kindness forevermore. My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you. You have looked with love on your servant here, and blessed me all my life through. God of mercy, hold us in love. In peace we pray to you. God of mercy, hold us in love. For peace and salvation we pray to you. God of mercy, hold us in love. For peace between nations, for peace between people. God of mercy, hold us in love. For all those who govern, that justice might guide them. God of mercy, hold us in love. For all those who labor in service to others. God of mercy, hold us in love. Keep watch on our loved ones and keep us from danger. God of mercy, hold us in love. Help us, comfort us all of our days. Keep us, hold us, gracious God.
Great and merciful God, source and ground of all goodness in life, give to your people the peace that passes all understanding, and the will to live your gospel of mercy and justice through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. God, remember us in your love and teach us to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread,
and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Amen.
Let us bless our God. Praise and thanks to you, Go in peace, share God's peace with whoever's around you, or at least a virtual peace to all of you. Have a good night.
Amen.
Amen.